here. How many of you remember the last time that you took a swing at a piñata? For some, it's been a little while, right? But you remember piñatas. As a kid, they're fun. As a parent, they're maybe less fun and more stressful. But as a kid, they're exciting, right? Because your whole life as a kid is like, don't hit that and don't be violent and keep your energy contained. And then you go to a birthday party, they put a blindfold on you, a bat in your hand, and say, just swing as hard as you want, right? It's just an awesome thing for a kid. But piñatas are fun. And piñatas are pretty incredible, too. They've got really elaborate ones, don't they? I mean, with all kinds of color and intricate detail, just some beautiful things. Some that are so beautiful, you just don't want to hit it. But then you remember, I want the candy, so then you take a big whack, right? These very intricate piñata. And now, making a piñata is very, very interesting, too, because there's a fine line. You've probably experienced, if you've been to many birthday parties with piñatas, you've experienced this. There's a fine line between the thing exploding on the first kid's hit and grown adults being fed up with every single kid not being able to break it, beating it into the ground, trying to break a hole in it, right? You've probably seen both sides. Some you can just cut right through, and others are just like a metal fortress protecting that candy, right? But regardless of what the piñata looks like, no matter how beautiful or intricate it is, what's the most important part of a piñata? The candy, right? And you could have this beautiful, ornate piñata, but if you fill it with Dum-Dums, peppermints, and Werther's Originals, no thank you, right? Hang a empty cereal box full of the good stuff, and I'll just hit that instead, right? Because what matters is what's on. Sorry if I offended anyone who likes reject candy. But I want the good stuff, right? What's inside of it matters. Now imagine that you're okay, maybe you're a grown-up and you're doing grown-up. You can tell I have kids when I say things like grown-up. All right, maybe you're an adult, maybe you're a kid. Picture yourself now. You show up at a party and you see the piñata. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's the most beautiful piñata you've ever seen. So much detail in the paper mache. And you think, oh my goodness, did they put this much detail and effort into the piñata? Imagine if they use half of that creativity and value to put this is going to be good stuff, right? And you get it's party time and you get to be the first one to take the swing, and you grab that broomstick or that baseball bat. Be careful with broomsticks and windows. But you're the first one to grab it, and you got the blindfold on. You can hear everybody else excited, and you take that first swing, pop, you hit it square. Oh, you could feel it rocking, and you know that was a good one. The second one, you take your second swing, boom, you feel it crack. You hear the anticipation of everybody, but not quite yet. And you take that third one, you're like, this is going to be the one. And you boom, and you feel it pop right through there, and your bat goes through, and you go, yeah, and you're waiting to hear the screams of excitement as everybody runs in and grabs all the goodies that are coming out. But instead, you hear screams of terror, and you're like, what's going on? And you take your blindfold off, and out of this beautiful piñata is pouring deadly poisonous spiders everywhere. Dude, that's a creepy mental image, isn't it? Sorry if I give you nightmares, all right? But that is so. I almost said snake, so that would have been either. Both of those make my stomach just all right? The picture of this death pouring out of this beautiful thing. Well, you know what? That's really close to what Jesus is going to do in our story today. He's poking at the spiritual piñatas of his day and exposing what's inside of it. He's taken a swing. And what we're about to find out is what's inside isn't as pretty as what's outside. Let's look at our text today. John chapter 2. We're going to continue in our study of John. The beginning of John chapter 2 was Jesus' first miracle, or as John put it, the first sign that Jesus did. And he's there in Cana, he's with his disciples, and he turns water into wine. Now, as incredible as this was, we learned in this story that not a whole lot of people knew even that this miracle had taken place. We don't necessarily know the bride and the groom knew about this. Only a handful. The master, the one in charge of serving the wine, did not know Jesus had done a miracle. Only a handful. Only the servants who served the water that turned to wine, and his disciples and his mom. A handful of people know about this miracle. It's the only miracle that Jesus has ever done. And he finishes that up. And then we come to verse 12. John chapter 2, verse 12. After the miracle that he had done, and after the wedding, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and disciples. There they stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords. He drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, the disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. So, we look at this story. Many of us, you're probably familiar with this story. Jesus comes in, clears out the temple when he sees everything that's taking place in there. And you go, well, that's not much of a pretty piñata hiding spiders, is it? I mean, that was pretty obvious that corruption was taking place, right? It didn't really disguise that very well. You know, you see, I hear some people, maybe they walk into a large church that has a bookstore, maybe a church that has a cafe in it, and you can buy not just your free coffee, but you get like an Americanos and all that kind of stuff. You walk into those big places, and I've heard it, and people saying, "Man, they're turning this place into a market. Oh, if Jesus walked in here, he'd turn over the tables." I don't think it's quite as clear as that. So I want to back up a little bit and look at this picture a little more closely. First of all, what this says temple. Jesus going to the temple, and there he saw people buying and selling things. What he's talking about? Well, the temple, throughout the scriptures, the word temple refers to two different things. It just depends on the context, and you got to kind of see that to understand the context in which the word temple is being used. The actual physical temple, the place of worship, was that place that contained the holy place. Only the priests were allowed to go. Like common people weren't allowed inside the temple. Only the priests were allowed to go into the temple. They'd go into the temple to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. And then inside the holy place was the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. And inside the holy place is the very real, tangible presence of God, right? Inside that holy place is the Ark of the Covenant. Above the Ark of the Covenant, is the resting place of God on earth in the fullness of his glory. And so holy and so incredible that only the high priest was allowed to go in there, and even then, only once a year. And so this is the temple, the housing place for God. And it was the place that they would bring sacrifices to worship God. Now, surrounding the temple was a temple complex, if you will. There was this large courtyard set out as this temple complex. We know that it says Jesus teaching in the temple. Well, he wasn't walking into the holy place teaching the priests there. He was in the courtyard. Jesus, I know it seems odd, was not allowed into the temple because he was not of the right tribe. That didn't work that way. That's not how it works. So he would be in this courtyard. And so on one side of this courtyard, this one section would be the court of the Gentiles. And there it was a place where they would buy and sell. And again, maybe, okay, but still, it's still the temple, still what's going on here. Deuteronomy chapter 14, I'm not going to read it, but just you can reference it later. Deuteronomy chapter 14, this is well before the temple was ever built. This is back when they worshiped the Lord in the tabernacle, which is basically a tent version of, a mobile tent version of the temple. God knows that he's going to someday pick a certain spot for his name to be worshiped and honored that we know is Jerusalem and in the temple. And so he says, in the designated place of worship, every year you need to go there and offer and Deuteronomy 14 specifically talks about the tithe, 10% of everything you have. But currency wasn't just in silver coins and whatnot, right? The greatest form of currency was goods. And so offering 10% would have been, crops and livestock and all those types of things. And so Deuteronomy 14 makes an exception, an allowance for those God-fearing people who live far from Jerusalem, who need to trek all the way there to offer their worship to God, be it their tithe, or it could also be, offering for a sacrifice or different types of things, a sin offering, those different types of offerings that are prescribed in the law. If somebody needs to make a long trip to offer that, then they can basically cash out what they would have brought, right? So they sell all of their goods, that 10%, turn it into currency, and in sake of the tithe, they bring it there and they give it to the Lord in the temple. Well, rather than just giving the money to the Lord, this is what it says. It says, you'd bring your money that you sold, that 10% that you sold, you'd take it there, you would buy whatever you want. And then it depends on what year it was. There's kind of a rotating system. Some years, you'd buy up maybe exactly what you sold, but you could buy whatever, eat it, consume it in the presence of the Lord as worship, or in the other years, you'd just give that over to the temple, and that would be what the priests and the Levites would live off of. It was God's way of providing for those who he has set apart for ministry. And so it says here in our text that Jesus, before Passover, was heading into Jerusalem. Now, Passover was a big deal. It was a very big deal. Passover was then as Easter is to us today. Right? Easter, for us in the New Testament, for Easter, those of us under the New Covenant, Easter is like the day of Christianity, right? It's the day that we remember. It's the day that we constantly go back to over and over and over and over and over. We are who we are because of Easter, right? Because Jesus rose from the dead. However, prior to that, which means in this story still, Jesus had not died on the cross, rose from the dead. Prior to that, Passover was that same celebration. Passover was the day that all throughout the Bible, you'll see it over and over and over again, that God tells Israel to remember the day that he set them free and saved them out of bondage to Egypt over and over and over and over again. Passover was to the Old Testament as Easter is to us. And so it was a big deal. So here Jesus is getting ready to go. It's a little bit before the Passover. He's going there to get ready, and he goes up to the temple. Well, Jerusalem, now people are coming all over the place to worship at the temple for Passover. Now this tiny little town of, not tiny, big city for them, 80,000 people. Just the population would just swell. Some say up to 200,000. Others say there's 2 million people coming at this time. But regardless of what the exact numbers are, tons of people are showing up. And they're all showing up for one reason, for the Passover, the worship of God. It's a holy swell, right? And so Jesus shows up, and the temple must have been buzzing. And when I say there's a courtyard around there, I don't mean a courtyard of the temple. I'm not talking about like a fenced-in yard like you'd have in your backyard. This is like 1,500 yards long. This is a massive area. And so Jesus comes into the temple, the courtyard of the temple, and he comes and he sees the buying and the selling of goods. Because they're buying and selling goods so that they could offer it then to God as worship, right? As prescribed directly by Scripture. But the Roman Empire was kind of in control that day, so currency was commonly in Roman currency, what most people used. However, the law prescribed certain values on things, and so they used Jewish currency, which meant not only did you have to buy and sell your what you're going to offer back to God, but you had to exchange it somewhere. You're going to the temple, so they set up places you could exchange your money for temple currency, for Jewish currency. You'd buy what you needed to buy, then you'd offer it to God. This is the church, if you will. This is the temple. This is the priest offering a service to the people in order to more effectively and with simplicity for those who are coming, worship the Lord. This was a great system. But what we're going to see in this story, and a couple instances that follow, is that what everybody else sees is not always what Jesus sees. What everybody else sees is not what Jesus sees. So Jesus, picture this, his ministry is beginning. He's recently been baptized by John. He went to the wilderness to fast and pray. His disciples started following him. He performed his first miracle. Things are really starting to get going. And now he's journeying. I mean, this all happened right before Easter, right? All right before Passover, the day, the great celebration of the Jewish people. He's heading down to the temple. And thinking this is God in the flesh, right? This is God. And Jesus showing up to the very place the presence of God has chosen to dwell on the earth, right there at the temple. This is a holy encounter for Jesus as he's beginning his public ministry here on earth. And I could imagine there's just a holy excitement as he comes to truly and fully worship the Father in the place that he has designated for worship. He shows up and he finds something totally different. It's not that he's never been to the temple before. But I just believe that in this moment, in this time, one, it was his appointed time. He was ready to go. Two, I just believe there was such just an anointing on Jesus that he could not bear to watch what was taking place. You say, well, what do you mean? I thought this is all good. See, the process was fine. The system was fine, but you know what they were doing? They were charging the ballpark of 20% on their exchange rate for their money. 20%. It's gouging people. And if that's bad enough, once they exchange their money, you ever been to a ball game and you go to the concession stand and go, where'd they buy these hot dogs that they cost $9? Why can they do it? Because you have nowhere else to go. This is the first stadium pricing. They show up and a dove that I could have bought back home before my journey for $1 is now costing me $20. But there's crowds of people. It's overpopulated city. We're in the city. We're not in the area. We're not out in the country. You can't just go find some livestock or buy it off of a local. I'm here to worship. I've got my money to worship, to present to God, to buy what I need. And I guess it's this. And then the priests, those who were coming to offer their tithes to give to the priest, they'd go, they'd sell their stuff, they'd show up at the temple, they'd exchange their money, get ripped off. They'd go buy their doves and their sheep and their oxen. They'd buy all those things and for an exorbitant price, and then they would offer it back as their tithe, as their worship to God, and then they would take those things and put them back in the pen and sell them again and again and again and again and again. It's extortion, it's manipulation, it's arrogance, it's greed, and it is the absolute disregard for the holy. And you know what? If you're a marketplace, like Jesus pointed out, and if you own the Pinnacle Bank Arena, sell those hot dogs for whatever you want to sell. It's your prerogative, it's business. But the part that's messed up is that the priests and the Levites knew that it was the command of God for them to do what they had to do. And so they were using what was meant for pure worship to make a profit. They were disguising their greed and manipulation as worship. And Jesus walks in, and everybody sees this is a system that we've always known. This is how God prescribed worship to work. We know that every time we come, we get ripped off, but that's just kind of how it works. This is the system that is prescribed in the law, so we just do it, and we can't control what the priests and the Levites and all those guys and the temple folks, we can't control all of that. We just come, we do our thing, and Jesus walks in, and he sees right through it. Says, this is not worship. This is just personal gain. And so what does he do? He forms a whip. He grabs some cords. It's interesting. You know, we picture Jesus like dedicating babies and holding children, right? Before he dedicated a single baby, before he took a single child in his arms and blessed them, he first grabbed a whip, which is just an interesting thought. We're about to see Jesus in light that we don't typically think of him. He grabs a whip in this massive courtyard filled with people all coming to worship God. And it says he grabs the whip and he begins to drive them all out. Now, in the New Testament, or in the NIV that I read, just for a point of clarity, it says that, so he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. That's verse 15. Now that all does not just refer to the sheep and cattle. In fact, most of the translations, if you're not reading the NIV, it'll say he drove all along with the sheep and cattle. That all is referring to the people. He clears the place. He doesn't just get rid of the animals, get rid of the vendors. He empties the place. Most likely hundreds of people. And he doesn't just by saying, excuse me, please find the nearest egg. No. He grabs a whip and just, get out. Okay. And the place empties out. Now, there's a few just curious things about this story. One, where were the leaders to tackle this guy and get him out of here? Just so you know, anybody does that in here on a Sunday morning, you have the liberty to tackle him and remove him, okay? Just, unless it's Jesus, leave him alone, but otherwise, right? Where was everybody going, hey, this guy's out of line? I think there's a couple reasons, a couple potential. We'll just leave it at that. A couple potential reasons. One is that it's quite possibly Jesus wasn't the weak wimp that we sometimes picture him as being, right? He talks about being gentle and kind, and so we probably think he was probably, 80 pounds soaking wet. He was a man who worked with his hands. We traditionally know him as a carpenter. Many believe, actually, there wasn't a carpenter, because there wasn't much carpentry back then. There wasn't a lot of trees. A lot of scholars believe that he was actually a stonemason, which would do the same thing the carpenter would do, except with stone, right? So his whole life, would be chiseling rocks and moving boulders. Now picture a guy who spends 30 years chiseling rocks and moving boulders, and he doesn't always match up with the same picture of Jesus that we see. Now, that's speculation a little bit. He could have just been a carpenter. Either way, he was a man who worked with his hands. And I want to propose that he was quite possibly not as weak as we sometimes picture him. So now this cut man comes walking in with the whip, get out of here, and people go, whoa, 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 okay. But let's say it wasn't. Let's say he was, 4'6" and 80 pounds. Have you ever experienced it before where there can be two people, one small and frail, one 6'10", 300-pound solid muscle, and yet the tiny individual can demand more respect and authority than the big giant? Have you ever seen that before? I believe in this moment Jesus was exercising a type of authority that put people back, and they didn't know what to do with it. A spiritual authority that demanded the respect of the entire temple. And everybody wanted to know what is going on. So everybody's gone. And now it's Jesus. And the priests and the Levites, the temple guard, I'm sure, those who are supposed to be there working there. And we go to the next part of our story. It says, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again. And, I jumped ahead. It says, then the Jews demanded of him. Now, it says the Jews. Not nearly everybody in that place was Jews. So this is not a generalization of Jews in general. Remember, we talked about this early on, that phrase, the Jews. John is going to continue to use that phrase to imply some negative connotation. It's not inherent in the word. There's no negative in that word, the Jews. However, he uses it over and over as a writer to cue us that there's some intentional evil intent behind their showing up. So here's the Jews. This is really probably those, the priests and those who are supposed to be there, those in charge. Then the Jews demanded of him, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? That is a very interesting response, isn't it? Okay, picture the scene. You got a couple of sixth grade bullies picking on a little third grader, okay? They're pushing him around, they're taking his money, they're making fun of him. But what the little bullies don't know, or what these sixth grade bullies don't know, is that this little third grader's brother is the senior captain of the football team. And all of a sudden, he shows up. And those bullies are going to do most likely one of three things. Realize they got caught and run. Begin to make excuses, pick him back up. Oh, we were just hoping, no, it wasn't what it looked like. Or in a moment, they might look around and go, okay, there's 5 of us, 1 of him, he's bigger, but we can take him. They're going to fight back, right? They're either going to run, defend themselves, or fight back. It's a natural response when we get busted. A parent walks in and sees a kid misbehaving or doing something they're not supposed to be doing. It's normal. The kid cowers and hides, knowing they can't get away, but still, that's the response. Or they start defending, Or hopefully your kid doesn't do this, or they'll just get all angry and flustered and fight back and throw a tantrum, their expression of fighting back. But none of that happened. They didn't defend themselves. They didn't stop him. I mean, what do you think the natural response would be? Jesus, what are you doing? What in the world do you think you're doing? This is the temple. They knew. They knew what he was doing. They knew what they were doing. And they knew they didn't have a voice to argue. They didn't fight him. They didn't run and just leave the place empty. They said, show us a miracle. Remember, he's not done any miracles. They don't know Jesus to do any miracles. He's done one, but it was in private. Now, isn't that kind of odd? What exactly is going on in the story? Why would they instantly say, we need to go we need to see a miracle? Basically what they're saying, well, let me read Malachi. Malachi chapter 3. You see, these guys might have been evil, but they did know the Scripture. Better than anybody, they knew the Scripture. And they knew that they were waiting a Messiah, right? I mean, not just everybody. All over Israel was waiting for this Messiah. And they knew the Scripture. Malachi 3 says this, see, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. That's John the Baptist. Then suddenly, the Lord you are seeking, the Messiah, the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. And then down in the middle of verse 3, for he will, this is what he's going to do in the temple, he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. They knew something. They knew that a Messiah was going to come, and when he came, he was going to come to the temple. And when he comes to the temple, he was going to purify it. They knew their hearts. They knew what they were doing. They knew they got busted, so they deferred to his authority. And they had to have been deferring to his authority because there is only one person who has the authority over these guys. These guys are the top dogs. And that one person, if he were to show up, he would cleanse the temple, and this is what this guy's doing. So they weren't running, they weren't defending themselves, they weren't fighting back because they were going, apparently this guy thinks he's the Messiah. And so what do they say? Prove it. Prove it. So, well, let's just look at this. Jesus clears the temple. They don't run, they stand up to him. They come right, not stand up to him, but they come right up to him. And they say, okay, we see what you've done. Clearly this is something that the Messiah would do. The only way that you're going to get away with this, the only way is if you show that you're Messiah. So we'd like to see some ID. They acknowledged it's the perfect way. If Jesus were to come clear the temple, this is almost the perfect way to respond. There's a lot of things they could have done. But they said, hey, we recognize this is Messiah-like behavior. We want to see it. Prove it. But you know what? Prove it is nearly always a statement of disbelief, not faith. I mean, here they are asking Jesus to do a miraculous sign, and it sounds a lot like they are doing, I mean, you got to have a little bit of faith to say, hey, we're not going to fight you because we believe there's a chance you're the Messiah, so let's just see a miraculous sign. That sounds like great faith, doesn't it? It looks like the right response. These guys might have had filthy, evil hearts, but they were great politicians. They knew how to respond to a scenario. They knew the right way to handle even the messiest situation, even Jesus coming in and busting up their party. They said, here, Jesus, let's see that you're the Messiah. But Jesus knew it was in the heart of a man. Prove it is nearly always a sign of disbelief, not a sign of faith. What about Gideon? We like to go to Gideon, right? Gideon tested the Lord. He did so out of fear, not out of disbelief. When an angel of God came to him and said, hey, you're the one I want. And he said, no, I'm not. And then so he basically told God, God, prove it. But it was a sign out of humble, ignorantly humble, and not the right kind of humility, but scared humility. But he said, God, I need evidence from you. And so we take that and go, man, I'm going to test God in this, and God, I need you to prove it. Well, you know what? You read the Gospels, read them. Every single time somebody comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, I don't believe, I need you to prove it for me. Every single time he says, no. See, the signs follow faith, be it small. Sometimes it's just a tiny little bit of faith. Like the man we referenced a couple weeks ago, his demon-possessed son, the disciples tried to cast it out, and they couldn't do it, and Jesus came and just said, do you believe I can do this? And he says, well, I believe, but help my unbelief. He says, I've got this tiny bit of faith. I want to believe, and I'm trying really hard to believe, and I'm looking to you at this time. And Jesus takes that tiny little bit of faith, and he performs a sign. I'll tell you what, I bet that guy's faith grew. But these guys were approaching Jesus with pushback from the beginning. There's no way you can be who you say that you are. Prove it. Right? Guys being all tough, somebody says, hey, I could knock that guy out in one swing. And his buddy says, prove it. What does that mean? I want to see my buddy get knocked out. That's what it means, right? Because I don't believe it at all. Prove it. And that's what they're saying to Jesus. You know what? I see people do this. They're like, God, if you would just do this and this, then I'll know that you're there. God, prove it. God, I can't believe that you're real. And God, I can't wrap my mind around this. God, you're going to have to prove it. You're going to have to make me believe. He's not gonna. Usually, I don't want to speak for God. He sometimes does things that are unusual to him, and sometimes he just works in ways you can't explain. And so he can do whatever he wants. Okay, I'm not going to put God in a box. But he's got a track record of not flaunting his miracles so that you can believe. But you know what happens when he does? You still don't believe. These religious leaders say, we want a sign for you to prove who you are. And Jesus says, here's the sign. Destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. First of all, they're thinking that's a sneaky answer and a stupid answer, right? I'm not going to tear down the temple so you can't prove it. You're off the hook. Jesus is sneaky like that. He'd give these great responses to manipulative questions. But you know what? He wasn't just giving him a runaround. He actually did that. It says he was speaking of his body. And this is why I say, if you approach Jesus with unbelief, a sign is not going to change you to then believe. So when we approach Jesus and say, God, I don't really believe in you. If you want me to believe, you got to prove it. He's not going to. And I know that, or most likely won't, because it didn't work with these Jews. He didn't give him a sign right there in front of him, but he left that place, and the whole rest of the week he was doing signs, and people started believing in him. For the next 3 years, he was doing signs, and people started believing in him. And then 3 years later, he did exactly what he said he was going to do, and his temple was destroyed by those that he spoke that to, meaning his body, and he rose it back up in 3 days. The disciples put the pieces together. But they didn't, because they didn't want to believe in the first place. And lastly, and this last part connects very closely to this. See, everybody sees worship, but Jesus sees personal gain. Then we go further into the story, and everybody sees the acknowledgement of Jesus. But Jesus sees disbelief. And then this last part is really tricky. And I'll be honest with you, I wrestled with this a little bit until I saw how it was woven through this entire text. Verse 23, now, this is ended. Jesus leaves. He leaves the priest there, the Jews, frustrated. He leaves. It says, now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, so throughout the week, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in them and believed in his name. Isn't that exactly what they wanted to do? Isn't that exactly what he wanted? That everybody would believe in Jesus, and he's doing signs, and people are believing, and praise God, this is awesome. Now this thing is rolling. And yet it said, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. Why? That's kind of a jerky thing to do, Jesus. You do all these signs, and everybody believes in you, and then you're just like, well, forget you. He didn't draw them in. Why? He drew in the disciples that followed him. He drew in John and Andrew. He drew in Peter. He drew in Philip. He drew in Nathaniel. He drew these guys in. He entrusted himself to them. How come not the rest of them that believed? James 2 gives us some interesting insight. James 2, verse 14 says, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Yeah, I don't want to emphasize on the deeds part right now. We're not going to go into all this, but I just want to highlight something here. It's a rhetorical question. Can such faith save him? Well, the implied answer is no. But wait, aren't we saved by faith? James is highlighting here that there is a faith that does not save. James illustrates it further in verse 19. You believe that there is one God. Good. Good job. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So sometimes we talk about it as, oh, we're saved by faith, and what we're saying, and it's so true, it's so true, it's so true. James and Paul work so well together, but it's so true. But sometimes we have this idea of faith, like James is refuting here, where if we just believe that Jesus is God, that's it. We just believe the validity that Jesus was the Messiah prophesied from the Old Testament, that he came. If we believe that, then we get life forever with Jesus. But if that's it, then why don't the demons get life forever with Jesus? Because they believe the same thing. The demons do not question the authority and the position of Jesus Christ. They know who he is. They believe him. Because they've seen him. And that's what these crowds were doing. Jesus goes out and he does these signs, these miracles. And it says people believed in him. Why? Because they saw his power. But Jesus didn't entrust himself to them. Why not? Because they didn't entrust themselves to him. See, there's an element of a saving faith that is one believing the right things, believing the truth about who Jesus is. But there's another element of our salvation that is entrusting ourselves to Jesus. And as we do that, he will entrust himself to us. But there's all these people. I mean, they all saw his power. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. There's 5,000 men plus their wives and children. Thousands of people witnessed firsthand, tasted literally the miraculous power of Jesus. They saw, and I'll tell you what, they believed. But when he died on the cross, even after he rose from the dead, where were those thousands? They're nowhere to be seen. In fact, there's 120 left. And that's just, if it was just one miracle that he did, you'd expect a better turnout than 120 after that. And yet he did it a second time. And then he traveled everywhere. And people were getting healed like crazy. And when it came down to it, there were only 120 people who ever actually chose to entrust themselves to Jesus. See, the third thing that people see, they see faith. But Jesus sees our heart. And And that's really the bottom of this whole thing. See, we put on a show of faith. We know how to do the Christian thing. We know how to do this whole worship thing. And that's where Jesus starts. See, in this passage of Scripture, we see first Jesus narrowing down on a specific point, worship. And then he begins to broaden out. But he looks at worship. Because worship is all about everything we can offer to God. It's about, we're going to look at it in a few weeks. In John chapter 4, he said, true worship. True worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. Is there authenticity and integrity in your worship? But we don't even know how we measure worship today, right? How do we measure worship? Was it today a good worship service? Well, we can worship God in a bunch of different ways and in a bunch of different places, but there is a sacredness to the assembling together of God's people. I mean, Paul says in the New Testament, don't forsake the gathering together, as some are in the habit of doing. There's a sacredness that takes place when God's people rally together for worship. You can worship at home, you can worship wherever you want, or your job, you can worship anywhere. But when we gather together to worship, what's the standard for good worship? Man, I just felt the presence of God, and that's good, and I hope you do. The presence of God is here. Sometimes you don't. I can feel, and we base successful worship on how we feel and our emotions. You know, if you were to ask somebody in the Old Testament or ask somebody in the story, tell me about a great worship experience. You know what they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you, man, I had this incredible harvest, and I was able to give my very best to God. The end. But we say things like, well, I didn't really get a whole lot out of worship today. Oh, dear God, I hope Jesus didn't come in with a whip. Because by our own words, we are doing exactly what they were doing in this text. We are making it about our gain. When worship, the measure of worship is about what you get out of it, it ceases to be worship altogether. And you've turned worship into a marketplace for your own positive emotions, a marketplace for your own spiritual feel-goodness. You know, I hope our goal is to create the most conducive environment for worship. And so, you know what? If it's really a big issue, maybe someday we'll have like a arm wrestling match between those who think the worship is too loud and those who don't think the worship is loud enough. I don't care. I mean, I want everybody to be able to come and worship, but listen. When we gather together, it's not so that you can leave feeling filled up, though I hope you are. When we gather together corporately for worship, it is so that we can offer the very best of what we have to Him. And in this context, let's sing with the top of our voices. I'm not much of a singer. Get used to it. I think there's going to be a lot of it in heaven. So whatever the practice of worship that you're in the midst of, would you join in and give our praise and our very best to God? Oh, God. I didn't get much out of it is some of the most condemning words that you could say about worship. But I've said it too. So that's the specific. And then Jesus zooms out and he hits a slightly broader thing. It says there's this area of belief, that you disguise your disbelief in images of belief. God, if you do this for me, then I will. That's a statement of an unbeliever, not a statement of a believer. Because a believer says, God, I'm yours, whatever you do. But God, prove yourself or else I'm out is not a statement of belief. It is a statement of an unbeliever. You see, we build this faith facade. But then he goes to the next level and says there's some who do have faith, some who've seen the power of God, some who've seen what he can do, and they truly believe that he has the power. But they've never entrusted themselves to him. On the inside, I mean, it's all just a shell. And here's the difference. In the first story of the worship, it was intentional and malicious. It was, I'm going to build this pretty facade. I'm going to build this pretty piñata. And I know it's filled with filth. But I'm just not letting anybody see it. The second is different. Because the second, and this can be applied to a lot of it, the second category here is those who don't even know what is inside is being corrupted. If we go back to the piñata, it's like salvation, and we're going to see the miracle of God changing us from the inside out. The salvation he gives us, we're a new creation, we're this brand new piñata, but we let what's inside grow stale for so long because there's nothing fresh inside of it. We get used to the routine and we sit on the shelf so long that it grows disgusting and rotten. And we've learned how to keep the outside fresh because that's what we have to do when we come to church. But we've disregarded what's on the inside. It's grown stale and rotten. I'm going to have the worship team come. We're going to close a little bit differently today. I promised I'd be tighter so that we could do this, and I wasn't, but we're still going to do it anyway. God knows what's in a man. He knows what's in a man. And that can be an incredibly encouraging, exciting statement. You know what? It'll also be pretty terrifying too, huh? So what we're going to do for just like 2 minutes, the worship team is going to play. We're not even a singer. They're going to play some music for us. And we're going to have 2 minutes. I want you to, before we leave, I want you to have a moment to reflect. Because here's the thing. Sometimes we know it. Sometimes as I'm speaking, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know exactly what you're dealing with. And none of us are perfect. I get that. None of us are perfect. There's some that we are doing a really good job of shining up the outside of our piñata while we are fully aware of the poison that lays within us. You need to talk to God about that. Because he is the God of new beginnings, and he can clean you out and fill you fresh. There's some of us, I think of King David. He prayed, see if there be any wicked way in me. David's going, I hear the message and nothing's resounding in me right now. God, I think I'm all right. But even then he says, but God, if there's anything I'm missing. You see, I could imagine those who put their faith in Jesus because they saw the signs and Jesus left going, how come this isn't working like I thought it was supposed to work? If they only prayed, see if there's any wicked way in me. See, they were wanting to believe in Jesus and receive his miracles, but they had nothing, didn't want to follow him. What was inside was still greed. It's still self-centeredness. It's still their own agenda. So we're going to take 2 minutes. We're going to dim the lights here for a minute. The worship team's going to play just between you and God. Would you just ask God, see if there's anything in me that you'd reflect on your own heart and reflect on your own soul, because he already sees what's in a man. He already sees what's inside a person, and sometimes he has better view than we do. So we're going to take just 2 minutes to reflect on our own lives.